So, good morning, everyone. I think we will be starting this session on science diplomacy. So, it is very much a follow-on on the plenary session that we had here today, and we'll try to dig into some of the concepts that were mentioned. So, my name is Irene Castellano, and I am going to be the moderator today in representation of the Science Diplomacy Task Force of the MCAA. I'll do a very little introduction on the SDGs, although Peter Gluckman did a very good introduction for me, actually. And then I'll go into introducing the speakers, and then we'll go into discussion. There will be time for questions also from the audience, so I will encourage you to get you thinking and ask whatever you feel will be relevant. So, just to start, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as you all may know, are a call to action to all countries in partnership to achieve a more sustainable and better future for all by 2030, which is quickly approaching. It's called the 2030 Agenda then, and it includes 17 goals and 169 targets. They represent the overarching framework for sustainable development policy for all UN member states. And as part of this, science, technology, and innovation is really key in delivering in this big agenda. So they can actually contribute to every goal and target, either directly or indirectly, and the COVID-19 pandemic really showed this to us. And however, there are current threats that are really threatening the achievements of the SDGs, as we all know. These include, but are not limited to, environmental degradation, climate change, erosion of trust in government and international institutions, increased inequality or global pandemics, to mention just a few. So just without further ado, I'll introduce my panel members. First of all, we have here on the floor Magda Wall-Soler. She is an international leader in science diplomacy. At the moment, she's the head of the Science Diplomacy Capacity Building at GESTA, which is the Genova Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. She's been recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, and she holds a PhD in biomedical sciences. So welcome, Marga.
Thank you.
We also have here Izaskun Lacunza. She is a science policy practitioner running the International Projects Unit in the Spanish Foundation of Science and Technology, FECIT. And she's really focused on bringing science beyond the frontiers of academia and support informed policy making. She holds a PhD in science diplomacy, and she was also really involved in one of the science diplomacy projects that were running under Horizon 2020 S4D4C. And then joining us online, I would like to welcome first Keith Hyams. He is a professor of political theory and ethics in the University of Warwick in the UK. He's interested in democratic design and the use of methods from philosophical ethics to contribute to interdisciplinary research on global challenges. He advised multiple NGOs and government bodies, including the UK Cabinet Office and the UKRI Global Challenge Research Fund. So welcome. And last but not least, Josiana Nikiemas. She's joining us from Canada, so I'd like to thank her because it's 6 a.m. over there. She's a professor in environmental sciences in the École de Technologie Supérieure in Montreal, and she recently moved there from the International Water Management Institute, where she worked for over 10 years, leading the Circular Economy and Water Pollution Research Group. So welcome all of you here. I'd like this to be a little bit of a panel discussion. And I'll start with Marga. So I've mentioned there are a lot of threats that are actually threatening the achievements of the SDG, and the complexity of these challenges that we face today is really huge. So my question is, what's the role of science diplomacy in all of that at the moment? And what's in relation to that anticipatory science diplomacy that Jesda is leading on, how can it be in the future? How can science diplomacy support tackling global challenges in the future?
Great. Thank you so much, Irene, and the organizers for having us here today. I think this question of science diplomacy for the SDGs is more important than ever, but also I like that you asked me at the moment, because this moment is different from 3 years ago, 5 years ago, when we were starting to talk about how science feeds or can help achieve the SDGs. And as you already mentioned, the SDGs are an all or nothing agenda, means that they are all interconnected. We cannot achieve one without the others, and that by design, they are connected in this way, so we cannot achieve zero hunger if we do not address climate action, education, gender equality, all of that, right? But the fact that the agenda is an all or nothing agenda makes it more fragile, because, as you say, in this moment, we are in a different geopolitical situation. We are in a different reality of the world that I think in the last 5 years, 7 years, for those of us that have been talking about this for a long time, we see a need for perhaps a reframing or a rethinking. And I think that also has been covered by Peter Gluckman and many of the speakers earlier, right? So one way to, so of course there's, I think the fundamental elements, like we need capacity building, we need, and we'll talk about this later, we need scientists to be more exposed to how science can help or enhance and feed policy processes. We need more policymakers, diplomats aware, and need to work, how do we work together? What are the common mindsets and spaces that we need, the boundary spanning? All of that, I think we've talked about it at length. But the question is, how do we continue this work when we have this, the crisis in multilateralism, when we have fragmentation, when we have science being weaponized and being basically the driver of conflict in the 21st century? How do we continue this global agenda when we have a pandemic that basically stops us on our tracks? And so for us at GESDA, so I'll just say a word about it, because it's a new organization. It's a foundation created in Geneva, in Switzerland, to try to bring an anticipatory perspective to science diplomacy in the context of multilateralism. What does it mean? It means that the international institutions were created in 1945 after World War II, and the world that we are today doesn't necessarily respond to the same logic and the same structures when the institutions were created. And many of these institutions are in Geneva, because Geneva is the seat of the UN in Europe, but also all of the specialized UN agencies, like the UN Meteorological Organization that hosts the IPCC, the WHO, which is now trying to figure out a pandemic treaty, the WTO, so all the questions of trade, the ITU, Telecommunications Union, all of the digital revolution, AI. So Geneva is a place where a lot of these discussions are held, but the institutions are not yet perhaps brought to the 21st century, if we say, right? So GESDA is created to try to infuse science and technology to the future of multilateralism, meaning that instead of working on the global challenges of today, and many of us here work on global challenges of today, there are many institutions that focus on the today and the urgencies, what we have to address now. But also, we need to think about what are we going to need in terms of diplomacy, of governance, of frameworks in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And why is that important? Because many of the science and technological innovations that we have today, we see retrospectively that we should have engaged with the policymakers earlier. And when these innovations are out into the world, it's too late to steer them towards beneficial uses or outcomes. So for example, most of you know the CRISPR story, right? CRISPR was a very basic science technique, meaning it was studied in yeast for decades, and no obvious human applications were evident for a very long time. When CRISPR made the leap into having revolutionary therapeutical potential and gave obviously the Nobel Prize to the researchers working on it, then suddenly we realized that it had a huge societal, ethical, moral implication, because we could basically very easily, molecularly, alter our lineage, basically create a new human species. And scientists around the world did not have a framework or a policy or an ethics envelope to decide where to go with this work. And as you know, in China, there were 2 CRISPR babies that were born. The same with AI. AI is a huge field that it is now a little bit out of control in terms of we can now go back and say, oh, how we should govern AI. We try, we have AI for good, we try to have recommendations, but it is not something that diplomatically we can, I wouldn't say contain or regulate, because it's not only about the threats, it's also about the opportunities. So anticipatory science diplomacy, what it means is that can we look at the science that is not yet basically ready for deployment in the world? Can we look at what's going to happen if in 20 years we have quantum computers and we have countries that have them and countries that do not have them? What are the risks and what are the benefits? Who will benefit and who will not? Who will access and who will not? And so how the world is going to require a strong diplomatic envelope to some of these technologies. The same with climate action. For example, there's a discussion on geoengineering. We could potentially spray aerosols into the stratosphere and lower the temperature of the Earth by 4 degrees in some theoretical models. But should we do that? Who decides? Do we need a global consensus? Do we need a treaty? Do we need some sort of framework to decide what are we collectively deciding to pursue as humanity or not? So this is the timeline that we have for the SDGs. It's actually very short, right? 2030. And we are looking at how we can anticipate the diplomacy that this science is going to need in the future. And so I wanted to just bring that perspective, because I think if we tend to only look at the challenges of today and the urgencies of today, which our policymakers, unfortunately, are pressed to act on the now, because they are elected by cycles of 4 years. And it's very difficult to have this long-term view when you have somebody that their own agenda is only 2-4 years. How are we, and Ithas will probably tell us more in terms of how that reflects in the legislative process, because it's very much connected. So my message to you today is that in this context of multilateral fragmentation, of erosion, as you say, in institutions, in science, in truth, what can we do to prepare for the threats and the risks of the future and maximize the opportunities of science to contribute to the SDGs through this perhaps more anticipatory and future-looking approach?
Thank you, Marga. Yeah, I think that's really needed. Look at the future and also the risks that all the scientific technology can bring us, especially now that the development of all these technologies is so quick.
Exactly.
It's so hard to keep up with any other disciplines that is not yours. So thank you so much for that work. So I'd like to go to Izaskun and go from this global view that Marga has given us, go more to Europe and the development of the European Science Diplomacy Agenda. We've heard about that in the session before, also yesterday in the parallel session that we had on science diplomacy. So what is this European Science Diplomacy Agenda, and what's the view of member states? Because diplomacy, it's something very, it's owned by member states a lot. Europe has some degree of movement there, but yeah, what's the view of member states on this European Science Diplomacy Agenda?
Thank you, Irene. Can you hear me? Yes. And thank you to the organizers as well. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Well, I think that we were discussing it yesterday already, that I think that we will all agree that Europe, widely understood, not only the European Union, has been leading the science diplomacy debate and intellectual thinking for many years already. And this is something that we should be all proud about. And there are many signs of this leadership, beginning with the 3 huge consortia projects that were led during Horizon 2020, to the Strategic Forum for International Cooperation Conversations, in which science diplomacy has been key in the discussions, but also in the global approach to research and innovation communication of the Commission, and also the Council conclusions. So when one reads all this documentation and all this policy thinking about science diplomacy, you reach the conclusion that Europe is willing to do something in terms of science diplomacy. And actually, we are all now expectant towards the European science diplomacy agenda. Are there challenges? Many. The first one, Marga was mentioning it, and I think it's essential. I mean, much of the work that we did regarding science diplomacy, I mean, academically within the consortia, was done in a world that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, we during dinner time, we were remembering Moedas and all this discourse about open to the world and all that. I mean, we all relate to that discourse, of course. I mean, it's in my heart. But, I mean, the world has changed so much in 4 or 5 years' time that probably one of the first things that we need to do is to rethink our own science diplomacy. And you can read it in the papers as well, that science diplomacy, yes, but what for? Certainly sustainable development goals, but with who, how, under which conditions, which reciprocity, and so on. And also, I would say that we have the practical challenges, because we keep talking about coordination, and here we are talking about, as you said, member states with their own foreign affairs policies, different ministries and foreign affairs, research and development, the External Action Service with the Commission. There are so many stakeholders involved that it's not practically easy to reach to a consensus. However, I am optimistic. And why? Because, I mean, if you think about the European Union, I think, again, that we should all agree that science has been fundamental in the construction of Europe. I mean, we talk about Horizon, the framework programs, as if it was a by default. It's an amazing agreement of many different member states, not only on how we are going to, what research we are going to be funding, also the values of our research. I mean, the framework programs stand for gender equality, responsible research and innovation, diversity. So, I mean, it's such an agreement and something that we've achieved among all of us. So, I tend to think that it comes natural that science will be embedded as well in our common foreign affairs strategies, because we fundamentally agree on what we want to do with our research and how we want to do it. I mean, Marga was talking about artificial intelligence. The IA Act, the European IA Act, has no comparison in the world in terms of how Europe understands artificial intelligence towards the benefit of its own citizens. So I kind of think that it's kind of a low-hanging fruit, but yes, there are many practical issues that we need to address. And we need to be patient and push for it.
Okay, thanks, Izaskun. It's good to have this positive mindset as well, because if we really want to make an impact, we have to have that. So I'll move to our panelist online, Keith. He represents a social scientist. So I'd like to move the debate a little bit from this high-level talk of science diplomacy to the ground, what a researcher can actually do on working towards societal impact and making sure that the work that they are doing is actually going in the right direction. So we've talked a lot about the complexity of the challenges that we are facing today. And many times I think we hear of technological solutions that could help solving a problem, such as what Marga mentioned, in terms of the temperature in the planet. Technologically, it is possible, but sometimes we miss that non-technical part of the problem, as especially people working in STEM, of course. So I'd like to ask you, Keith, you've done a lot of work in fairness and equity in innovation. So how can we ensure that we take those into account in the innovation process? And how can we make sure that we are making progress towards societal impact? Do we engage with stakeholders early in the process? Is that an option? Please, can you go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, as you say, technological solutions absolutely can have unintended side effects and can fail if they don't take into account social and political context. And that's true whether we're talking about the big interventions like Margot was talking about, geoengineering, worldwide use of CRISPR and artificial intelligence. And it can also be true whether if that's sort of on a smaller scale, whether that's a city or neighborhood scale. You can find that certain groups are benefited, other groups are either neglected, even is sometimes harmed, and you can get threats to basic ethical requirements like privacy and rights and so on. So another example at the more city level would be the use of seawalls to adapt to climate change. And they can be very good at protecting certain populations and certain urban centres from the risks of sea level rise and hurricane impacts, but they often just end up pushing risks elsewhere by altering the coastal morphologies. We've seen that, for example, in Lagos with the use of seawalls there. So I think you're right that part of the solution is to bring on board social partners early on, but beyond that, we need to think about which social partners are involved. So it's often so many different stakeholders. Are we talking about city authorities, national governments, local groups, and if so, from which part of the population? So it's really important to think about who's participating and what the power dynamics in those interactions are. And this is where interfacing with social science can help. Social scientists can help to unravel the social and the political dynamics and advise on what the problems might be and who needs to be brought on board early on and at what stage. So yeah, absolutely thinking about what disciplines to bring on board in order to think about those social and those political dynamics and how best to interface with them. So, I mean, it might be you need partners who can help to establish trust with the public or with user groups, or maybe in the case of things like AI and biotech, you need partners who can think about the ethical issues, the justice and the equity issues, partners who can advise on which groups to prioritize and how to ensure fair and equitable planning. And I'll just give you one example from our own work with the city of Cape Town, where they've been using technological solutions to adapt to the quite severe challenge that they face in the case of climate change. As you might know, they're very close to running out of water there, as well as contending with impacts of rising sea level and storms. So they're using technological solutions, but we've worked with the city to think about how different groups are benefited by these different solutions and which ones are currently being neglected. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it tends to be the sort of poorer districts that are neglected, and often actually their lot's made worse by some of the interventions. So we're thinking about how to bring in new groups. For example, there's sort of youth groups in the slums that are affiliated to this NGO called Slum Dwellers International. So we're thinking about how they can have a voice in planning alongside the city policymakers to think about what sort of technical solutions are useful to them and how they're deployed and how that interfaces with the social dynamics. So I think overall my answer is yes, absolutely. It's really important to bring in social partners early on, but it's also important to think about who participates and how they participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of talk about stakeholder engagement, but it is a work on itself, and it has to be well planned and well thought for it to be effective as well. So thanks for giving those examples. Then I'll move on to Josiana. She, as I said before, she has worked in, well, she's a leader in circular economy and water pollution well, she's now in Canada, but she's worked a lot in the Global South. And I'd like to ask you, how do you make sure in your projects, when you are developing those solutions, how you make sure you are making progress towards sustainability and not only towards development? And what are the main challenges that you can have to actually bring that real impact in such a complex places such as Ghana, where you were working before?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity. As you rightly said, over the last 10 plus years, I have worked extensively in developing countries, and my goal was really to help address issues related to waste management and circularity. And as you all know, solid waste management, liquid waste management, they are global challenges responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, causing very important health and environmental impact. And not only that, they are very costly activities that many cities in the developing world are struggling to manage effectively. So, especially now, the urbanization rates that are higher and higher in the developing world, the challenge is that the cities grow at a pace that clearly does not align with their capacity to handle the issues of waste management in an effective way. So the research I was engaged in really meant to address these glaring issues, for instance, how to develop technologies that are adapted to the local context that could be used durably, meaning sustainably, yielding benefits for a large number of people in the targeted communities, or how to set up the suitable institutional arrangements to strengthen the practices on the ground, or even how to enhance the business climate for waste management to become potentially more attractive to private sector than it is right now, and eventually convincing them to invest more resources into this kind of activities. And we can go on talking about how to mitigate the health impacts and overcome the social barriers, as has been mentioned a little bit earlier. So this kind of research, of course, has an intent to support development. But development in this case, of course, we have in mind that we need to improve the conditions of people. But then the issue is that, and the experience that we have so far is that development, of course, needs components of sustainability. And the challenges we are facing today, if we talk about climate change, they are in part due to the fact that some sustainability was not necessarily embedded in the practices that were promoted years before. So development calls for improvement, while the sustainability works to ensure the durability of the change that we have promoted through our interventions. So in this sense, they are both complementary concepts for someone like me working on the ground, and there was need to make sure that those elements were tackled in a way, in a simultaneous way. And the challenge beyond this complementarity is that there could be some tension between the short-term needs in the ground and the long-term considerations. And in that case, the biggest question would become how to think about the future when already the present in some ways is at risk. So some challenges that I faced as a researcher working to ensure the sustainable development is really how to address those two elements, the short-term needs and the long-term ones, in a very effective way at the same time. And there is usually a cost to building the future in today's plans. So as a researcher, if you want to, let's say, to adopt or to promote more sustainable practices, in my case, that I can mention water reuse practices to reduce consumption or better manage the water resources, then it means that we need to invest more today. And that investment can be, for instance, to ensure that water is not just treated to ensure that basic treatment is satisfied, but treated to a level that would enable its safe reuse in different contexts. And the biggest challenge as a researcher then in this context would become how to justify these extra costs that are required to put those mechanisms or those technologies or solutions in place. And to do that, usually you need to demonstrate your benefits and you need to quantify them, which is not easy, especially when you are working and operating in a system where data may not be sufficiently available, where sometimes also there is a lack of solutions that are adapted to the local context that can really help you achieve that. So these are the kind of issues that we were facing on the ground. And I would also mention that clearly there is a need for more awareness to be raised around these issues to ensure that, like I think one person mentioned earlier, it's very important to ensure that the solutions that we put in place today do not necessarily or only solve the problems of today, like governments who elected and has a mandate to solve a number of issues, but also integrate that long-term vision, which is necessary for the sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Luciana. That was great. You've touched upon so many issues. That was really interesting. So I'm wondering if there's any questions from the floor. I have a few more here, but in case anybody would like to ask now, that would be possible. Somebody on the back, please. Well, maybe in the meanwhile we can.
Hi, thank you very much for this fruitful discussion and these wonderful insights. I have a question on the social inclusion that we talked about before. Like we can recognize the importance of including different parts of the civil society in research and in research interventions. But how do you reach out to them? For example, like the lower income side of a city that might be the most impacted by an intervention. How do you actually involve them when once you've recognized that they're one of the main stakeholders? How do you reach out? Thank you.
Thanks. So I don't know if either Keith or Josiane maybe can talk on their own experience.
Yeah, if I can come in and bring a little bit of the perspective that I have on the ground. Communication is extremely important. And I think one thing that is also important and what I have seen, and I was going to talk about it in a moment also, was that most of the time, some of the projects that are being implemented in the developing world, they are being sometimes framed from the north. They come with a certain vision, with a certain intent, and it becomes a little bit like, if we are not careful, it becomes a top-down approach, where we come with our solution and we come to the communities and we let them know that we are coming to help them in a certain way, and we have defined like a strategy or a pathway through which we want to implement the project or we want to address the issues. And it becomes very difficult because in such a case, you come with your lenses in a way, and you miss the local perspective, and you miss the local realities that you may not necessarily be familiar with. So one way of doing this, I think co-creation is very important to begin with. Co-creation where you work with the local communities, first of all, to understand what kind of issues, what are the key issues that they would like you to solve in priority. And then beyond the co-creation, who should be involved to make sure that this works well. So asking the community those questions will be very important. And I think from my experience, usually works better than trying to work beforehand to identify who we should talk to, and then go to just talk to those people. Because from our lenses, the way we look at those stakeholders might not be how the community sees them. They might not have the kind of I would say, recognition that might be required to ensure that there is adoption ultimately of the solutions or whatever that we are bringing to the community. So I think communication is important, engagement at the source, and co-creation. All these things should be put together. And again, we have to be careful to prevent coming with a top-down approach, which happens still quite often, unfortunately, in the developing world.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I would agree with everything Josiane just said. And I would also add that there can often be trust issues if you're coming in as an outside party, especially Global North parties. So it really helps to try and find local partners who've worked with the relevant groups before. Often that might mean approaching a local university and seeing what contacts they've had. And quite often there are community groups, and those community groups are a good way in. But it's really important to know not just that you have sort of a stakeholder from the community, but to understand what's going on within that community in terms of power. And often we kind of see token participation, and it turns out it's sort of the older men who are invited. So getting on board the right partners from the start who can advise on how to build up trust if it's not already there, and who to invite and how to make sure there's proper participation is really important, rather than just charging in and saying we need that community, so let's just kind of invite them along and hope it works. So yeah, basically everything Josiane just said, and a little bit extra.
Yeah, I think this this requires a whole new set of skills for researchers, probably. Again, we need so many different skills nowadays to develop our projects, but this links very well to my next question to Marga on capacity building. You are a leader in capacity building in science diplomacy. You've set up this field and you helped its growth, but researchers have so many competing demands on what they have to do to succeed and to become established researchers, especially early career researchers. So what's your take on how much time researchers should put or focus on understanding this complex world and understanding how they can make a change, and how can we ensure that also this soft skill development is equal in the global south and the global north, and we ensure we don't go to the global south with these top-down approaches?
Right. Thank you. This is the million-dollar question. So, how much time do we have? But so, first of all, the term soft skills, right? We really now, I think, agree that communication and negotiation and cross-cultural awareness, understanding that all of these skills that are required for science diplomacy, they are not soft at all, because if you only have the technical knowledge and you don't have any of those skills, you cannot possibly succeed at that interface. So I think the reframing of the skills, no longer as soft, is important, and we need another term to differentiate it from the technical, hard skills. But that really, I think, is important. So we don't put one set of skills above or below the other. So there are many aspects to this. I'll just mention a few. First, the incentives, right? The way our academic system is structured in most parts of the world still is that your only currency, your only reward, the only metric that you are evaluated against in university are your publications, your grants, and it is very difficult to justify spending time doing anything else. So the question of how researchers, for example, volunteer for the IPCC assessments, how do they sometimes testify in Congress on particular issues, all of this time is sometimes not appreciated, not rewarded, or even punished, right? And even though I think we're making progress in seeing grant requirements to have this broader impact section, that more and more we see that you need to justify societal impact for your grant, but then at the same time, when you go out and try to do this societal engagement or this policy engagement, it's, as you say, competing with your core mandate that you are paid to do your work or your research. And so it is not easy. And I think we have models where so the question first is, do you want as a researcher to have an academic career and contribute to policy diplomacy on the side, but continue your career as a researcher? Or do you want to work at the interface? And those are separate pathways. So if you choose to stay in academia and contribute with your science and your evidence to the policy process, we need a set of mechanisms and incentives that is different from those who decide, okay, I want to perhaps go and work at the interface. And for that, we have fellowship programs, we have mechanisms that allow you to take yourself out of the university and put yourself, for example, in a government office that allows you to learn how policy works and contribute your science from there. For example, the first program that is very well known in the US, the AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellowship, started a whole trend or movement of programs that put scientists into policy spaces for a year or two. And then some of them go back to academia. And it's very interesting, those that try to do that have the barriers, of course, being behind, like a year or two being behind in the field, not having that publication gap. But then I've seen some of them catch up very quickly, because now they know how the funding works and how to get that grant, because they've been on the other side. So it is interesting to see how we can reconfigure or structure careers. And I think, as we were talking before about the assessment, how are we going to change scientific career? What does it mean today to have a scientific career, to be a scientist, to be a researcher, and how are we going to be evaluated? So I would love for you to comment on that in terms of what's the thinking in those processes that you are involved in. So this is about I think, the challenges and the tensions between how do you dedicate the time and be recognized or rewarded and not punished for it. But then the question of how do we get this training and this exposure. So there are many, as you know, science diplomacy training programs with S4D4C. We did an online course, which is still available. You can take it. So there are many very well-established programs. I would like to offer and invite you to a new one that we are organizing in Geneva. If you're interested in this dimension of anticipatory science diplomacy, I don't know if there's I sent a slide, maybe I didn't send it early enough to put up in the...
Okay.
No, that's okay. I'll come to you after if you're interested, and I can show you. So we are running a Science Diplomacy Week Immersion program in Geneva in May, which tries to kind of think about the updated framework for science diplomacy training and education in this context of the future thinking. So we bring people from around the world for a week to basically immerse in the science and diplomacy ecosystem of International Geneva. So I mentioned all of these UN institutions, universities, the diplomatic actors, and to have that experience like in the field, like it really in going to the institutions and seeing the work done on a day-to-day basis. So if you want to understand how the IPCC works, if you want to understand how WHO comes with the health regulations, if you want to understand how ITU is thinking on an AI for good framework. So we basically bring you to all of these institutions to directly interface with those that are in the process of designing them. And then we have it's very fun, and I have two representatives of the pilot program that we did last year. They sit in the front row, not because I paid them to sit in the front row, I promise. Alicia and Renaud. So any questions you can also ask them, and I'm sure they will be happy to talk about the experience. But the idea is that we try already to bring together the type of multi-stakeholder setting that we need to think about the science diplomacy issues of the future. So we bring scientists, obviously social and natural scientists, diplomats, but also members of parliament, private sector, so very important in terms of who should be at the table in science diplomacy. If you think about basic science, more and more now happens in the private sector, not in academia anymore. So we have this change of paradigm that a lot of basic science is happening in startups, deep tech startups, companies, and those are no public findings. Those are not necessarily peer-reviewed, published, and of course there are many of them protected. So in the field of neurotechnology, where Renaud is working, the field of biotechnology, synthetic biology, all of that now we are seeing the developments very much hidden, as in a corporate space. So when we talk about how to deploy these scientific advances for the benefit of the world, it's no longer about just academia feeding into policy. So it's a much more complex ecosystem and web. So having private sector at the table is fundamental. And of course, then the multilateral institutions, they must be, of course, represented. So this is the pitch to invite you to apply to this program. There are scholarships available for applicants from lower middle income countries, because really we want a global representation. And also is an experiment for us in terms of how to design this science diplomacy curriculum, what works. So we do a lot of experiential learning. So it's simulating role-play scenarios where one plays the scientist, the other plays the diplomat, the other plays the business person. And we really try to recreate what a real negotiation would look like, to try to think about the issues in advance and the different perspectives, the different trade-offs, and then that's how you develop the skills, the negotiation, the understanding, the different mindset, and the best way to learn is not by sitting and listening to a professor, is to actually be in the situation where you are faced with this decision and this tension, and you have to work with others to arrive to a negotiated solution. So this is the program, May 8th to 12th in Geneva, and we would love to have many of you there, and especially because we're going to have pretty much half scientists, half diplomat, business, other category. And in terms of which scientists should be there, I think in this group I always say that the Marie Curie Fellows represent this diversity, but also diversity, cutting-edge expertise, geographic, disciplinary, is such a wonderful group that really, I think, embodies what we need what representation we need to have in this conversation. So we would love to see you in Geneva in May. So talk to me or to our illustrious alumni representatives in the front row for more info on the program and the content.
Thank you, Marga. It's great to hear all these opportunities. So if we are interested, we could go for them. So, and it sounds very interesting, those panel sessions where you just do role play. But maybe in the real world, it's asking how does actually happen? What can diplomats do to maybe help scientists do better or work towards these development goals, and the opposite way, what can scientists do maybe to help diplomats through their diplomatic channels to do some progress, or what can they do together, because maybe it's not helping each other, it's actually coming up with something new together. So
yep, so I think that during this morning we've made already the case for diplomats and researchers, and I would even widen the scope, policymakers and society, to address global challenges together, right? I mean, I think that is already kind of agreed. The big question is how we do this, and are we doing this good enough? I think the answer is no. But I think that we are starting to understand the way that we need to start addressing this. And I'm going to be using as an example I work at the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology, and we just signed an agreement with the Congress of Deputies here in Spain to set up the Science and Technology Office there in the Congress. And we've been working for 1 year already, quite successfully, I would say, and we start to understand how academia and members of parliament should be working better together. And some of the findings that I think that are completely exportable to the question of science diplomacy is that we need diverse careers. I think it was Mostafa making the case this morning for that, and I can only agree. So in the office, in the Science and Technology Office of the Congress, we just hired 5 researchers to work as scientific advisors to the Congress of Deputies. I think it's the very first time in Spain that a public institution as ours calls for PhDs to do something else than academic work. And it was groundbreaking, I would say. We had 600 applications from researchers wanting to do something different to research in their labs. It's truly amazing. The other thing, and I'm pretty, that one is quite close to my heart because I am a scientist, and I think that we have a lot to think as the research community that has to do with knowledge. So basically what we do, the team that we have put together, is that the Congress of Deputies commissions us with a report, artificial intelligence being one of the first, but also cybersecurity, you name it. And then it's in our hands to put together a report about the state of the art of that particular technology or whatever to the Congress. How do we do it? Well, of course, we read as much as possible. We try to contextualize within the public policy and so on. But we also talk to 20, 25 researchers for every particular report. And then when you start doing the interviews with the researchers, you realize how disconnected academia is from the policy making, because we as academics try to blame on the policymakers not paying attention to us, being ignorant of what we do. But what about us? I mean, it's been challenging for us as the brokers of the knowledge to actually make sense sometimes of what was happening because of research being so disconnected. I'm not blaming the researchers. Please don't get me wrong, because there are so many things that are completely broken in the system that forces researchers to work like that. But I mean, we have had so many conversations like, your answer is not working for us because the under lab conditions, it's not an answer for me. Why aren't you working with a social scientist, I don't know, to analyze the impact of your technology? Why is everything so disconnected? So I think that we need to be working as our knowledge needs to be much more meaningful. I remember an example of somebody telling us that some artificial intelligence experiments, they were trying to solve issues that were already solved. in the medical practice. And yes, you always have the excuse that it's, you know, basic research, you're testing something, but why have you chosen something that is already solved? You know, like, so I think that we need to think much better on how we are putting our knowledge together so that it makes sense to the diplomatic world, but in general, for the public good, for the public value of science. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think you are completely right. We have been trained in a way that we know a lot about our specific subject, but we are creating silos. And now we need to work again multi, inter, and transdisciplinary, and we don't know how to do it anymore. So I'd like to go to Keith about this because you've done a lot of work on this field, so could you give us some insights? We have 5 minutes also left, so yes, be a little bit brief, but yeah, I love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think there can be really good benefits to interactions between STEM and social science and humanities subjects, whether that's a project that's kind of in conception a social science project, or the other way around if it begins with the STEM. So I'll give you an example where a social science-driven project has benefited from STEM involvement. And that's some work that I've been doing in a Horizon Europe project on democracy, thinking about how to make democracy more participatory and deliberative, and how to address some of these issues of short-termism that we were talking about earlier. As well as having kind of institutional innovations there, some of the technologies that are available now can make possible new forms of participation through kind of apps and electronic means. So we have technologists on board with that project, and we're bringing together the social science and the technology to kind of design these new forms of democratic participation. So you can get really exciting sort of science opportunities that are driven from a social science project. And conversely, a lot of the focus of our conversations so far has been on the need for social science to participate in STEM-based projects. And I think maybe not in every single project, but in almost most projects, it's really important to have social scientists involved in the development, just to make sure that the technological solutions do meet the need, and indeed, as we were saying, that there is in fact a need. And it's not just kind of, here's the problem, let's get the social scientists to tell us what the solution is, but actually we need the social scientists on board to even work out what the problems are in the first place, because otherwise we're going to find out that the problems have been missed, and we've had a few examples along the way. Another example would be we've seen green measures trying to make cities more environmentally friendly, particularly in Europe. But one unintended side effect of that has been that we've seen increases in property prices and gentrification, and lower income groups have been pushed out. And often that's been the result of a technological solution without the social and the economic and the political input from the word go. So we keep coming back to this idea that we need this collaboration. And as I touched on earlier, we're a diverse bunch, social scientists. It would be really kind of odd to say, here's a social scientist project, we need a STEM partner. I mean, we need to be more precise about what kind of science we need. And conversely, rather than just saying we need social science to be involved, I think the point we're at now is it's well recognized that we need social science in these projects, but there's work to be done on kind of, I mean, if you take Horizon Europe as an example, the calls often say now needs SSH involvement, but actually it's more precise than that. It depends on what the topic is, what you need. Do you need someone that knows about politics? Do you need someone that knows about ethics? Do you need a lawyer? Do you need an economist? And there's all these different areas of expertise. So I think the challenge now is to work out how to work out what kind of expertise from not only the STEM side, but also the social science and humanities side is needed, and to do more work, as we're saying, to break down these disciplinary silos, change the incentives, and foster more of the culture of interdisciplinary working across social science and STEM subjects. And I think that's beginning, but time is tight, and there's a lot of work to do there. But I think we are moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Keith. So this has been a very exciting discussion. Actually, it is already 1 o'clock, so I think I'm gonna wrap up the discussion, but I would really like to thank you all. I really tried to connect this global view with the local view. Hopefully it was a useful discussion for everyone. I'd like to just make some little announcements now at the end. There's some books about science diplomacy cases that were developed by the Insight project. They are outside, so you can take them if you are interested in seeing actual case studies on science diplomacy. And then we will have just the lunch now outside. And there's also the poster and networking time now as well. So I hope you are enjoying your time here in Córdoba, and see you around. Thank you all. Thank you.